Hello everybody, welcome to the first episode of Mr. Rankington. I came up with that name in a day, so, you know. Now, this isn't my first ranking show, as my previous one, Game Rankingers, was, well, it only had 2 episodes, so I would hardly call it a series, but that was my first time doing something like this. But this is kind of a spiritual successor, and for some of you it may seem like a step down from how I did those previous ones. But this is just going to be a lot easier on me, so I hope you understand. Now, to start out the first episode, I'm going to be talking about the Ratchet Clank series. And just in case you're wondering how old this is before Rift Apart on PS5 even has a rating, so obviously that game will not be included on the list. Now, before I get started, I am going to mention that I won't be ranking the ports as separate rankings. I may mention them, but I'm only going to be counting the original releases of the games. Now, to start things off at the bottom, we have Secret Agent Clank. This one, let me put it this way, there are a lot worse games out there, I mean a lot worse. But this is definitely the worst Ratchet Clank game. It kind of keeps that normal Ratchet Clank gameplay, but it does make quite a few changes, and I can appreciate what they were attempting to do with those changes, but it really feels like a half-ass attempt. Honestly, this game feels like it should be some sort of multi-platform licensed game. Not a two-platform not licensed game. But honestly, that doesn't make it bad, it's just, you know what I'm saying. But as much as I've been trash-talking this game, it's not really bad, it's just, well, it's close to bad. But sadly, the PS2 version of this game was the last PS2 Ratchet Clank game. What a way to go. The next game on the list is Ratchet Clank Full Frontal Assault. I was debating on whether this one was worse than Secret Agent Clank or not, but ultimately I thought, it's not. I mean, it's not really that bad, it's just not my cup of tea. I'm not a big fan of tower defense games. What this game tries to do is mix together the regular Ratchet Clank gameplay along with a tower defense mechanic, and I just wasn't a big fan of it. The thing that was pretty disappointing about this game was this was the game we got for the 10th anniversary of Ratchet Clank. I mean, yeah, technically we also got the original trilogy ported to the PS3, but in terms of original games, this was it. I mean, I can't complain too much because this was only a $20 game when it first came out, so it wasn't trying to be a fully priced game. I can appreciate that. It's just overall, I couldn't get into it, mostly because of the tower defense thing. But let me give you a warning. Do not get the Vita version of this game. Do stay away from that. If I was ranking the ports as separate rankings, that would definitely be at the bottom. Next up is Ratchet Clank Size Matters. Now, this game was fine as a PSP game for the most part. I mean, there's not much they could do compared to the PS2 Ratchet Clank games. So what they did here was okay. The problem is that the game's difficulty gets, well, it gets a little out of whack. The graphics for the game, well, yes, they aren't going to be as good as the PS2 games. They could have been a little better. You could just kind of tell that this game was a bit of a rush job, but honestly, for being the first portable Ratchet Clank game on a portable PlayStation system, it was alright. As for the PS2 version, well, it definitely was a lazy port, but it was better than Secret Agent Clank on PS2. Next up on the list is Ratchet Clank Future: Quest for Booty. This game is fine for the most part. I mean, it was the first Ratchet Clank game that didn't have a full price and it was download only, at least here in North America. The problem with this game is it's ultimately forgettable, it's very short, and you won't be missing much if you skip over this one. The gameplay is pretty much a slightly modified version of Tools of Destruction, so the gameplay is fine. This game was pretty much made just to give people something while they waited for a crack in time the very next year. So in that case, it's okay. For those of you who are wondering why I'm showing the PAL box art, well, that's because, like I said earlier, it was released digital only in North America. It did have a physical release over in Europe. And the next game on the list is Ratchet Clank All for One. I know it seems like I'm putting a lot of the spin-offs at the bottom, but that's because I don't really like these as much as the regular games. Now, this game can actually be pretty fun if you have friends with you. If you don't have friends with you, it's still fun, kind of, but not as much. You can tell this game was recommended for 2 or more players because if you play by yourself, they'll give you an AI character to work alongside you, and sometimes they can be stupid. This game also feels like it can drag on a bit, and sometimes it feels like it takes forever to get to a save point where you want to stop. But overall, it's a fine game. It knew what it wanted to be, and it was mostly successful at it. It just shouldn't have been released at full price at the time. The next game on the list is Ratchet Clank PS4 2016 movie tie-in game, whatever you want to call it. Now, this game is not bad. It's actually pretty fun, for the most part. There are just a lot of issues that kind of keep it back from being one of my favorites. I guess you could say I think it's one of the best movie tie-in games, but not one of the best Ratchet & Clank games. I mean, this game is very gorgeous in terms of the graphics, and the gameplay is pretty good. It's just that there's a lot of things about this game that feel very lacking. Like, you would have to see the game to know what I'm talking about. So this is mostly a middle ground Ratchet & Clank game for me, where it's definitely better than some of the others I've talked about, that's why it's here, but it's also not one of my favorites. Again, that's why it's here. Also, the movie this is based on was not as bad as most people say, but it was kind of underwhelming. The next game on the list is Ratchet & Clank Into the Nexus. This game was good, and I mean just good. It wasn't anything else. This was the final PS3 Ratchet & Clank game, and actually takes place before Rift Apart in terms of story. This game is good, it's just, it was forgettable. Like, I've only played through it once, and I have forgotten a lot of what happens, for the most part. This game is kind of in between being like a fully priced game and a digital game, because it came out at $30 here in North America. As a send-off for the PS3 Ratchet & Clank games, it was fine. It's obviously not my favorite Ratchet & Clank, but it's good. Something I should have mentioned at the beginning of this is that I won't be talking about the mobile games, mostly because I can't play them anymore. I will just say that Before the Nexus was okay. Anyway, up next we have the first PS3 Ratchet & Clank game, Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction. Whew, that's a mouthful. This game is good. Obviously it's higher on the list, but it's still not quite my favorite. It still would be far from being my favorite. At the time, this was a really impressive looking game. I mean, it was the first PS3 Ratchet & Clank game, and it really felt like the next generation of Ratchet & Clank, but it also has a lot of problems. One problem this game has is, well, as a lot of Ratchet & Clank fans may tell you, it was kind of the start of a word a friend of mine would use, kiddie-tizing the Ratchet & Clank series. I mean, this was the first mainline Ratchet & Clank game to receive an E10 rating instead of a teen rating. I could go more into that, but I think I'll save that for another type of video if I decide to make it. Or you could just look it up on YouTube. There's other YouTubers that have talked about stuff like that. But anyway, there's a lot of other types of problems, and one that really sticks out to me is the difficulty balance. I mean, by the time you get into the later levels, no matter how high your nanotech is, it seems like you die in like 2 or 3 hits depending on the enemy. But overall, I still enjoy it, it's just I don't enjoy it as much as the ones I'll be talking about next. Next up, this may surprise some people, the very original Ratchet & Clank. The reason I say it might surprise some people is because those people may wonder why I put this below A Crack in Time. Well, let me explain. I love this game to death, I have a lot of nostalgia for it, and it was a fantastic first game in the series. The thing is, it still kind of feels like the first game in the series. There are things in this game that I like better than in A Crack in Time, but in terms of gameplay overall, I feel like this game has too many slow moments for it to be really one of my favorites or above that game. It barely is below A Crack in Time, but it is below it. But don't get that twisted, I still really love this game, and in terms of nostalgia points, I like it much better than A Crack in Time, but when you take those nostalgia points away, I can admit that there are things in it that are not as good. But I'm still going to end this on saying that I love this game, just so you all understand that. Have I said I love this game yet? Speaking of A Crack in Time, the next game is Ratchet & Clank Future A Crack in Time. To get some of the problems out of the way, this game is a lot more quote-unquote kiddie-tized than Ratchet & Clank Tools of Destruction, but that doesn't bring down the gameplay necessarily. And there are some little problems here and there, some things with continuity issues, but again, doesn't affect gameplay, and when speaking of the gameplay, I love it. This game has my favorite version of the Clank gameplay, it has one of my favorite versions of the ship gameplay, and there's just a lot of mechanics that are pretty cool. This is definitely my favorite PS3 original Ratchet Clank game. It's obviously not my favorite Ratchet Clank game overall, but it's definitely in my top 5. Now the last 3 on this list, it was very hard for me to choose a certain order because I love them all almost equally, but I have kind of decided on how I'm going to rank these. So next up is Ratchet Clank Up Your Arsenal. This is such a great and memorable game, and it just has a lot of content to it. And the only reason that it is not my number 1 favorite is because of some very few flaws. Some very few. That sounds so great. This game has a lot to it, like different modes that you play in the story. You have a multiplayer mode that no one really used, but is still not too bad. And it was really great overall. Now the problems I have with it, one thing is, like I've said in some of the previous ones, the difficulty. Sometimes it can get a little out of whack in some areas. Another problem I have is kind of a little problem, but it feels like that some of the characters are a little too mean towards Ratchet & Clank. I don't know what they were going for when they were writing it, but yeah, that was, I didn't like that too much. One more tiny gripe I have with this game is it was kind of the start of Ratchet & Clank going in a more linear direction, which, I mean, the other games were linear, but they felt a little more open than how this game did it. And don't get me wrong, I really like linear games. It just depends on how linear they are. But overall, this is a really great game, and the positives definitely outweigh the negatives. And one little note I should mention is that the PS3 version of this game, the loading screen, for some reason the ship noises are out of place. You'll have to hear it to know what I'm talking about. It's noticeable, but you do get used to it, so it's not a big problem. Next game is Ratchet Deadlocked. One word to describe this game, a lot of the other games too, but mostly with this game, is addicting. I can understand some people saying this game gets pretty repetitive, which I wouldn't exactly disagree with them, but it's not like it really feels all that repetitive because it is so much fun. I guess this is considered a spin-off, but obviously I hold this one in much higher regards than any of the other spin-offs, which is why the other spin-offs are near the bottom. This one is just about the number 1. It's got addicting gameplay, like I said. It's got a lot of memorable moments. It's got a lot of funny dialogue and cutscenes. This game just has a lot to it. All I'm going to say right now is, don't get the PS3 version unless you really want those trophies and you don't have a PS2 to play the PS2 version on. It's not a bad port at all for gameplay, but for cutscenes and stuff like that, it's pretty bad. Well, that leaves only one game left, and that game is Ratchet & Clank Going Commando. This game, it's so good. Now don't get me wrong, there are some flaws about this game, and there are things that were better in the later games, but the way this whole game is set up, and the way it just laid down the foundation of how the Ratchet & Clank games are going to be in the future, it's so good. Yes, nostalgia has a little something to do with me liking this game so much, but even if you take that away, this is still my favorite Ratchet & Clank game. And this has my favorite version of the Insomniac Museum, which is weird because this was the first Insomniac Museum in any of the Ratchet & Clank games, so you would think that some of the later ones would be better, but I like this one best, in my opinion at least. Now of course, like I said, this game is not without its flaws. It can get a little repetitive in some areas and some things can kind of drag on, but when the gameplay is so good, you don't really feel it all that much. But yeah, overall, I love this game to death. And that wraps up this episode of Mr. Rankington. I hope you all enjoyed. This is more of a listening thing than a watching thing, but if you watched it or listened or whatever you did, I hope you liked it. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and subscribe if you want to potentially see more of these. I don't know how many I'm going to do. I only did 2 episodes of Game Rankinger, so who knows how far this one will go. But anyway, thanks for watching.